An incident occurred which interrupted the routine cruise programme after the fleet had held its annual sailing regatta at Argostoli in the Ionian Islands to the west of Greece. The Queen Elizabeth was on her way to Macedonia with a view to giving the leave to the ship's company to visit the highest Christian church in the world, 7,000 feet up on Mount Athos, when news was received that the city of Salonika had been destroyed by an earthquake. Immediately, course was altered to the scene of disaster, and 2 companies of seamen, with shipwright and medical detachments, were equipped for landing. Smaller ships of the fleet were ordered to proceed at speed to the eastern side of the Chalcidice Peninsula, where it was reported that the villages of Eirosios and Stratoni had been completely demolished, and 70% of the population killed. At Salonika itself, we found that a portion of the city was badly damaged, and a bottomless chasm 16 miles long opened up. During the 4 days we were there, everything possible was done to help the people of this northern Hellenic city in their great distress. It was clear that as a nation they were no strangers to disaster. They reacted philosophically and courageously to the toll of earthquake. There was no panic, nor mass exodus. The Greeks gained much respect from the British for their fortitude and conduct, not least that no looting took place of shops or houses anywhere. Landing parties, acting under the guidance from the prefect, were deployed in giving first aid and to assist with rescue work hampered by falling buildings. I had charge of a platoon of seamen with instructions to clear a very poor residential area of damaged houses. The procedure was simply for a naval shipwright to clear a building unsafe. A plank would then be placed across the inside of an upper story or window, and a rope round it dropped to the ground. Incredible as it may seem, 10 or so strong men pulling on a rope could, in this matter, topple a fair-sized house. From our point of view, the whole operation was an invaluable, unrehearsed exercise. As many men as could be spared from the ship were landed. For the majority, it was their first taste of death and destruction. Some were visibly shocked by the scale of damage, and were sickened by the sight of the mutilated bodies, many with beautiful young faces, bearing all the signs of the terror they had endured. Few of us slept during the time we were ashore, and only the older, more experienced men wanted anything to eat. Water had to be brought from the ship because the local supplies quickly became contaminated, and the discomfort of all was exacerbated after 48 hours by the stench from decomposing bodies in the heat of the day. When the Greek civil and military authorities had the situation under control, the landing parties returned on board with messages and tokens of gratitude from Prime Minister Venizelos and the people of Salonika. The ship left with many of her young seamen the wiser for their experience, and better equipped to face the horrors of war for which they were being trained. The Commander-in-Chief in those days had to act more as an ambassador of his country than as a senior British naval officer in the Mediterranean. At times, he must have felt not unlike the Duke of Wellington who, during his campaigns through Spain, France and the Low Countries, had an occasion to leave a dinner party or state ball in the early hours of the morning to take horse and hurriedly rejoin his army in the field. Like the Duke, Admiral Chatfield was a great fighting man, but he was no socialite. He must have wearied of the functions he had to attend in full uniform, while his officers and men were able to enjoy the places visited in a relaxed manner. When not so committed, his favourite pastime was shooting and, for this purpose, the QE, from time to time, went to remoter places where game abounded. Although a very junior gunroom officer, I got myself involved in the Admiral's shooting parties through a disgraceful gaffe on my part. It occurred at the beginning of a winter cruise in the eastern Mediterranean, when the fleet was deployed for an important night exercise. All ships were closed up at action stations, and the C&C and staff were at their battle stations on the Admiral's Bridge. I was duty midshipman on the upper bridge for the middle watch. At around midnight, when not much was happening, the C&C and his staff retired to their sea cabins to rest. The fleet was approaching the southern tip of Greece, and the master of the fleet, the senior navigator, told me to call him immediately. Cape Matapan light was sighted. An hour or so later, I went down to report to the master that the light was up. I should have known where he slept, but although I had been in the ship for a year, I had not before ventured onto the staff bridge, which was forbidden ground. I knocked at the door what I thought was his cabin. One of the things that midshipmen were taught was to knock and enter an officer's cabin, not to wait a reply. I entered the darkened cabin. Another thing we learned was never to shake a sleeping officer, address him by appointment or name, and get out. Master of the fleet, sir. Cape Matapan light in sight. File on the port bow, time 0209. I reported to the recumbent body on the couch. Before I could get out, an authoritative voice from the bunk boomed, "What the devil are you talking about? This is the Commander-in-Chief." I fled, and in my panic to get away, I clean forgot to call the Master of the Fleet for his blinking light. For the rest of the middle watch, I imagined everything dreadful happening to me in the morning. Sure enough, a few minutes before I went off watch at the conclusion of the exercise, the Admiral's orderly came onto the upper bridge, saluted me smartly and said, "Sir, With the Commander-in-Chief's compliments, would you breakfast with him aft at 8:15? That was clearly an order, and at the appointed hour, clean and shaved, but not having slept, I reported to the flag lieutenant, who ushered me into the cuddy. Besides the C&C, the only person at the breakfast table was his Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral W.M. James, who, as a boy, had sat as the model for Sir John Millais' famous child portrait, Bubbles. The first question to be fired at me was, how was I getting on in the ship? The Admiral then told me that he and his Chief of Staff both knew the Queen Elizabeth well, having served on board her in the last war as Flag Captain and Commander respectively to Admiral Beatty. The C&C then asked me what I liked doing most in the places we visited. I replied, shooting. Good, said the Admiral. You must join us sometime. Not a single word was said about the appalling mistake I had made during the night. Some time afterwards, I learned that the Commander-in-Chief regularly dined out on the story of how he was called in the middle watch to fix the ship's position, something he had not been invited to do for 30 years. He delighted in telling the ladies that he had been mistaken in bed for a young navigation officer. Vanity in another can work wonders. It certainly saved me. Instead of being keel-hauled, as might have been my fate in Nelson's day, I had caught the Admiral's eye. In the very near future, it was to bring me some good sport and, later in my naval career, a much-coveted appointment. For those with a shotgun on board, the best sport was to be had in Albania. Partridge shooting, and a lot of exercise, could be found in most parts of Greece and Cyprus, but this wild country had everything, including wild boar hunting. In 1932, an official call was paid by the Commander-in-Chief at Durazzo, the main port of Albania, with a long history of invasion and conquest. I can remember wondering at the time if the object of this stop was not in some way connected with the arrangements for a shooting expedition afterwards. Be this as it might, the visit had all the appearance of strict formality. As the Queen Elizabeth approached the harbour entrance at 8 o'clock in the morning, with all hands falling on deck in No. 1 uniform, a 21-gun salute was fired, and the Albanian national flag run up to the masthead. After breakfast, the Prime Minister, Padeli Evangeli, called on the C&C and was saluted with the 17 guns on leaving. Later, the C&C went ashore and was received by His Majesty King Zog. History relates that the king had to murder 4 brothers before he could accede to the throne. Since then, so many attempts were made on his life that he had to vacate his palace at Tirana, the capital. He now lived in rural hutments out in the scrub country behind Durazzo, surrounded by swamps and guarded by 100 armed men. That afternoon, the ship was opened to visitors, and boatloads came on board. Most of the male guests carrying knives or revolvers, which had to be surrendered. A table was rigged on the quarterdeck and the weapons placed under the charge of the corporal of the gangway. Several of the pistols were museum pieces, with beautifully carved ivory handles, and all of them loaded. While we entertained the local populace and the children on board, the ship's football team landed to play the Tirana First 11. If the referee had been stabbed and our goalkeeper brought back on a stretcher, none of us would have been surprised. As it was, our players said that it was the best and cleanest foot game they'd ever had since leaving Plymouth. The ship won by a goal in the last 5 minutes, and the crowd was conspicuously generous for the visitors throughout the match. Admiral Chatfield, assisted by the officers and men of his flagship, having discharged his official duties, His Majesty's ship Queen Elizabeth, being in all respects ready for sea, weighed anchor at midnight and proceeded 100 miles down the coast to Butrinto, a remote bay at the southern end of Albania. A shooting party consisting of the Admiral and his staff and 3 senior wardroom officers was organised. Much to my surprise, and the envy of the gunroom, I was invited to go with them. I had been forgiven, and not forgotten. On arrival at Butrinto, we found HMS Whitshed waiting for us. The shooting party embarked, and the destroyer proceeded close inshore to Santa Corenta, 10 miles down the coast. On landing, we were met by a party of Albanian hunters, dressed for anything, and driven onto the rough country behind Lake Butrinto, some 40 miles inland, where we split up into 3 parties, and surrounded the area which was about 5 miles across. Despite the bitter weather, for which we were inadequately clothed, and the lack of dogs, which meant we wasted much time looking for shot game, the shooting was excellent. The Admiral killed 94 mallard to his own gun on the 3rd morning, and ran out of cartridges. I was sent back to Santa Corenta to tell the Whitshed to return to the QE for more ammunition. At current fuel prices, I cannot see a destroyer being used for such purpose today. In the meantime, our host lent us some homemade cartridges, many of which failed to fire. Our bag at the end of the 4th day was over 400 duck, a sack full of snipe, and 36 woodcock. Whitshed took the party on to Corfu, where we rejoined the QE, who had gone ahead of us the day before. The duck was distributed around the mess decks, and the snipe and woodcock given to the officers' messes. The south of France in spring was a popular playground for officers and men of the fleet, and the ships properly assumed a holiday spirit on this cruise. Because of their fine harbours, Toulon and Villefranche were used by battleships and aircraft carriers. Cruisers, destroyers, and submarines had to lie at anchor off such smaller places as Cannes, Saint-Tropez, and Antibes. Men from these latter ships had thus to chance the weather, and they were not necessarily put out if they found themselves stranded ashore for the night, with money enough to make the most of it. For gunroom officers alone, the Riviera visit posed a problem. It was decreed in station orders that leave for midshipmen was restricted to 2 late passes a week. Our ingenuity, and so our fitness for higher rank, in finding ways of getting back on board every night unseen by the officer watch was put to a severe test. Not surprisingly, resulting from l'affaire Midshipman Gray in Beirut, special watch was kept on QE's junior officers. The Côte d'Azur in the 30s was living in the afterglow of fashionable Edwardian days, when the arrival of the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, in the royal yacht Victoria and Albert, heralded the start of the social season. The Riviera then was more English than French. After the First World War, the presence of the flagship of the British Mediterranean Fleet coincided with the arrival of the international set, though on a much reduced scale of grandeur and entertainment than at the turn of the century. In less than 10 years, that way of life was to end completely and forever. My first visit to Villefranche in the Queen Elizabeth started grandly enough, with an invitation for officers to a ball given in Monte Carlo by the Prince and Princess of Monaco, who asked particularly that midshipmen be allowed to attend. I was one of the lucky ones from the gunroom to go, and I well remember what a magnificent full-dress occasion it was. For me, it was especially memorable because I was introduced to a girl of 17, with whom I kept up an exchange of correspondence for the 3 years that I was on the station. Her name was Jacqueline, and her parents very kindly asked me to make use of their house in Nice whenever I was ashore. I think I must have lost my heart for the first time, and certainly my head, because I was reckless enough to break my leave every night during the ship's stay. To get back on board unseen, I had to find a local boatman to take me round QE's bows, and down the unlit side of the ship. Thence, with the officer of the watch out of sight, pacing the quarterdeck, I went up the lower boom ladder and down the nearest hatchway, to be free to repeat the process the next night. An old battleship's vast quarterdeck could be transformed into a very impressive ballroom, with the latest dance music provided by the Royal Marines and played beneath the highly burnished muzzles of QE's 2 after 15-inch enamelled guns, under the red and white striped ceremonial awning, and with the assembled company magnificently attired in their different national uniforms and dresses. It was difficult to imagine a more impressive and colourful scene. No wonder that an invitation to the valedictory ball given on board the fleet flagship at Villefranche each year was highly prized. Little did the grand ladies, in all their finery and jewels, realise, or care, that the unsprung teak deck on which they would be dancing had, a mere week before, been pounded by ferocious seas, and, although treated liberally with French chalk, that the surface was little better than their corniche, and as such murdered to their feet, and that, for its proper function, the quarterdeck was perforated with scuppers, ring bolts, and cleats, each one a death trap for any woman not wearing the flattest of sensible shoes with reinforced toes. Never mind, they loved coming, and quickly became transported with delight, thus rendering themselves insensible to the pain they were suffering until the next morning. I invited Jacqueline to the final ball on board. After the interval, we thought we would try and get out of the ship unobserved, and go to a nightclub in Nice. It was the only opportunity I would have of going to the famous Le Perroquet, normally frequented by wardroom officers and strictly out of bounds to midshipmen, but on this night all ship's officers were required on board for duty. I told Jacqueline how I got back on board each night without being seen, and led her along the darkened upper deck to the lower boom where my pocket boat was waiting, ready manned to take the guest ashore as required. Without hesitation, she climbed over the guardrails and somehow managed to traverse the length of the lower boom in long dress and high-heeled shoes. Halfway down the swinging Jacob's ladder, one of the bowmen came to her rescue and carried her, laughing merrily, into the boat. The crew enjoyed the subterfuge, and the coxswain took us inconspicuously around QE's bows to the shore where we found a taxi. I confessed to Jacqueline that I would be shot at dawn if any of the wardroom officers ever discovered what I was doing, and the girl said that her parents would deal with her in a similar manner, if they got to know where we were going. She was looking radiant, and I felt very grown up. After we had been dancing for a short while in the smoke-filled, dimly lit nightclub, to my intense horror, I saw a back view that I knew only too well. It was the master of the fleet. Being on the Admiral's staff, he was not obliged to be on board for a ship's dance. It was more than my life's worth to be spotted by him of all people, after my failure to call him in the middle watch for Cape Matapan's light the year before. So I hurried my bewildered partner out of the place, bundled her into a taxi, and ungallantly left her at her parents' home. Back in Villefranche, I stowed away in the forepeak of the second picket boat on its next trip back to the ship and climbed on board unseen. So ended a sweet romance, unromantically. We were not to meet again. Jacqueline never married. During the war, she joined the French resistance movement and played a leading part in giving safe conduct over the Pyrenees to escaping British prisoners. She was arrested by the Germans, flung into a cell and tortured. Having refused to reveal the names of her contacts, she was taken early one morning into the market square and, in the forced presence of all the villagers, blindfolded and shot. Towards the end of my time in the Queen Elizabeth, I was to make the acquaintance of Noel Coward. He joined the ship in Malta and accompanied us on a month's cruise around the Greek islands in connection with the founding of the Royal Naval Film Corporation, on which he and Lieutenant Commander Lord Louis Mountbatten, then serving on board as Assistant Fleet Wireless Officer, did so much in the years ahead. The already prominent playwright was given the only spare cabin on board, in a dingy corner of the midshipman's chest flat. Because my sleeping billet at the time was on the deck immediately outside this small cabin, Mountbatten asked me to act as his doggy. Guide, should Noel Coward want to know anything about the ship or what was going on. Of course, I thoroughly enjoyed doing this, and our guest could not have been nicer nor more interested in everything he was shown, but he needed quite a lot of looking after. He seemed to have no idea of time. It took at least an hour to dress for any occasion. He had with him at least a dozen silk shirts and an equal number of pairs of shoes, and he always kept boats waiting at the gangway. In the Greek islands, he spent most of the time exploring ashore, and in the cool of the evening would entertain officers on the quarterdeck. What nicer way to end the day than with a cigar and glass of brandy, and listening to Noel Coward playing the piano and singing his favourite songs, with the sweet scent of the sisters wafting out over the water from nearby Skiathos. He will be remembered by the midshipmen who shared that cramped living space below the waterline of an old battleship, by the expensive scents from several different bottles that filtered through the mesh curtain separating him from us. A welcome contrast to the rank smell of the collision mat. A large square of canvas and thick coir placed outboard over a hull to stem the inrush of water, stowed in our limited quarters. Noel Coward disembarked at Missolinghi at the western entrance to the Gulf of Corinth. Before returning to London, he was able to climb to see the monument erected in honour of Lord Byron for all the work he did to help the Greeks in their liberation from the Turks, and he was buried there in 1824. Having passed our examinations in seamanship and been promoted acting sub-lieutenants, it was time for us ex-midshipmen to return to England. We took passage in the P&O liner Naldera on her way home from the Far East. The ship was to stop at Marseille for one night before going on to London. To celebrate our promotion and my 20th birthday of the week before, several of us, and some soldiers on leave from India, decided to have a party ashore. We asked the purser where we might go. He was not enthusiastic. He said that Marseille was an evil city by night, and no fit place for young officers like ourselves. That fixed it, we set out. The sensible purser's final warnings to us was to keep off the pavements along the ill-lit back alleys of Dockland, and walk down the middle of the street. Strong-armed women, posing harmlessly as prostitutes, would lurk in porches, he said, and if you had had a bit too much to drink, they would knock you down, strip you of all your clothes and valuables, and leave you in the gutter to find your way home in only underpants. By the early hours, we had been to half a dozen places of so-called amusement, each one more second-rate than the other. Disillusioned, we were returning to the ship and we were attracted by the strains of Cole Porter's My Heart Belongs to Daddy, coming from a dance hall crowded with people of every description and nationality. We found a table and ordered 2 bottles of wine. After a short while, we were accosted by a coloured man, seemingly very drunk and gesticulating wildly. Without any provocation, he suddenly attacked one of the soldiers in the party, laying about him with his fists. I jumped up to intervene, whereupon the attacker picked up a bottle off our table and aimed a blow at me. I dodged, and the bottle crashed to the floor. A second coloured man then appeared and seized me by the throat. At that, we all lost our tempers. Partly in anger and partly in self-defence, I grabbed the other bottle of wine and brought it down as hard as I could on the side of my attacker's head. It broke in pieces, and the man went down like a 9-pin, with blood gushing from his neck. Instinctively, I looked under the table to see what damage I had done to the unconscious figure on the floor, when I felt someone touch me on the back, and an unmistakable English voice said, firmly in my ear, "Leave him, get out quick, you're in great danger, it's a put-up show." I passed word to the others, and we fought our way to the door through a hostile crowd that was gathering around us. Outside, we easily had the legs of several pursuers, as we purposely headed in our direction away from the docks. In a few minutes, we were hopelessly lost in the back streets of Marseille, thankfully with nobody following. It took us nearly an hour to find our way back to Naldera, with the problem then to face of how to get on board without having seen and raising the alarm. The soldier and I were in a terrible mess, blood and or wine all over us. How were we to explain our condition? We need not have worried. A passenger liner at 4 o'clock in the morning is not the same as a warship with ever-vigilant officers of the watch and corporals of the gangway about. Although the ship was floodlit, there was not even a cat to be seen anywhere on the deck as we went below. I remember thinking to myself, why does a merchant ship have rat guards and all the berthing wires, when any self-respecting rat has only to walk up the gangway to get on board? I felt certain that the police would catch up with me, and that I would be charged with assault and attempted murder. Accordingly, Instead of going to my cabin, I locked myself in one of the main deck WCs, having told the others to know nothing about me if asked. The ship was not due to sail for another 6 hours. At breakfast time, one of the ex-midshipmen came into Laverick to see if I was all right. He said that the city police were on board with a passer inquiring about a fight in one of the dance halls where a man had been beaten up during the night by seamen from a visiting ship and had subsequently died. My release from agonising suspense did not come until I heard the welcome sound of Naldera's deep-toned siren and the throb of the ship's main engines. Half an hour later, my friends gave me the all-clear to come out. I remained in my cabin until the ship was well out into the Mediterranean and all risk gone of her being ordered back to port, before going up onto the bridge to report to the captain. He told me that he regularly warned his crewmen not to be tricked into a trumped-up argument in Marseille, resulting in arrest for drunken behaviour or theft. In resisting, the victim would often be charged with assault and held by the police. If the ship was sailing shortly, he said, a heavy ransom would be demanded for the seaman's immediate release, which was often paid, in preference to his being left behind to face trial, or the ship made to hand over heavy demurrage while waiting for the case to be heard. The captain advised me to be more careful to avoid such places in future, and he wished me every success in life.